A tear falls. It runs down a cheek, catches the light for a moment, and you reach up and wipe it away without thinking. It is gone, and you have no idea what you just destroyed. Because if you had let that single drop dry on its own, slowly, undisturbed on a clean surface, and if you had then looked at it through a microscope, you would have seen something that should not be possible. You would have seen a landscape, rivers branching into smaller rivers, coastlines, valleys and ridges and deltas. A whole world, drawn in salt, left behind by one drop of grief. And here is the part that has no easy explanation. That small dried world, the map your tear leaves behind, looks almost exactly like something a telescope finds when it points at the death of a star billions of miles away. The same branching, the same shapes, the same pattern, written once in the salt of your sorrow and again in the gas and dust of a dying sun. How can that be? Why would a tear and a nebula share a shape? Why would the thing that falls from your eye when your heart breaks carry the same design as a cloud of cosmic gas wider than our entire solar system? It sounds like the kind of thing someone makes up to sound profound. It is not. It is a real fact about real patterns, and the closer you look, the stranger it gets. Because the resemblance does not stop at tears and stars, the same branching shape shows up in the rivers that drain a continent, in the veins that carry blood through your own body. In the path, a bolt of lightning tears through the sky. In the spreading roots of a tree, the bare branches of that same tree in winter, the cracks in dried mud, the airways deep inside your lungs. One shape, repeating, at every scale, in things that have nothing to do with each other. A tear is mostly water and salt. A nebula is mostly hydrogen and dust. A river is rock and rain. A lung is living tissue. And somehow they all reach for the same form. So before we ever get to a single equation or a single experiment, sit with the plain strangeness of it. You cry. The drop dries. It leaves a map. And the map is the same map the universe draws when it builds a star, carves a canyon, or grows a tree. Either that is the emptiest coincidence imaginable, a trick of the eye, three things that look alike for no reason at all, or it is a clue. A clue that the same small set of rules is at work in your tear and in the heavens, that grief and starlight are shaped by the same hidden hand, that the patterns of the cosmos run straight through the salt water on your face. This is the question we are going to follow all the way down. And we are going to start in the most intimate place there is, not with the stars, with the crying itself. It begins, as everything here begins, with a single drop and the question of why it falls at all, with the simple, universal, deeply human act that you have done 1,000 times and never once understood. And you have done it. Everyone has. There is no human being who has not cried, no language without a word for it, no culture that does not know the sight of a face wet with grief or joy. A baby's first act in the world is very nearly to cry. We come in crying, and many of us go out the same way. And in between we weep at the things that move us most, the things we cannot put into words, the things too large or too sharp for the rest of the body to hold. Crying is one of the few things that every person who has ever lived has shared, across every border of time and place and tongue, and almost none of them, in all of human history, has known what it really is, or why the salt water that falls from our eyes should carry, hidden in its drying, a map of the heavens. Begin with a question so obvious that almost no one asks it. Why do you cry at all? Not why your eyes water when you chop an onion, or when wind blows grit into them. That kind of watering makes sense. It protects the eye. The strange kind is the other kind. The kind that comes when you hear a piece of music and your throat tightens and your eyes fill, though nothing has touched them. The kind that comes at a wedding or a funeral, or the moment you see someone you love after a long time apart, the kind that comes from feeling. There is no dust in your eye then. Nothing physical has happened to the surface of the eye at all, and yet your body produces liquid, real liquid with real weight, and pushes it out through your eyes in response to a feeling. Think about how odd that is. An emotion, something with no shape and no substance, reaches into your body and turns a handle, and out comes water. Why? What is the water for? What possible reason could there be for the body to weep at beauty, at loss, at love? And look at what actually sets it off, because the list is stranger than you would guess. People cry at funerals, yes, but people also cry at weddings, where everyone is happy. They cry when a soldier comes home, when a lost child is found, when a team wins against all odds, when a stranger shows unexpected kindness. They cry at music that contains no words at all, at a swell of strings or a single held note. They cry at the sight of something vast and beautiful, a mountain range, a night sky, a newborn's face. What do these have in common? Not sadness. Many of them are joyful. The thread that runs through them is something harder to name. It is the sense of being touched by something larger than yourself, something that overflows the ordinary banks of feeling. We cry, it seems, at the moments when meaning becomes too great to contain, when the heart is filled past its capacity and the surplus runs out through the eyes. Grief does it. So does beauty. So does love. So does awe. The tear is what happens when feeling exceeds the vessel, and maybe that is the first real clue to the mystery of its shape, because overflow, the spilling of too much through too small a channel, is exactly the kind of process that the rest of nature solves, with branching rivers and forking lightning and the spreading arms of a galaxy. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. And here is something stranger still, something that sets you apart from every other creature on the planet. Other animals make sounds of distress. A dog whimpers, a wolf howls. A whale sings what sound to us, like the loneliest notes in the world. Animals feel. Few people who have looked into the eyes of a grieving elephant or a frightened dog could doubt it. But as far as anyone has ever been able to show, no other animal sheds tears from emotion. The eyes of other animals water to stay clean and wet, the same as yours. None of them weeps from a broken heart. You are, on the evidence we have, the only animal on earth whose sorrow leaks out of its body as salt water, the only one whose feelings have a liquid form. Whatever crying is, whatever it is for, it appears to be ours alone, woven into the human animal and almost nothing else. And that fact, the loneliness of human tears in the animal world, is the first clue that crying is not a small or accidental thing. It is the first hint that something deep is going on. Why us, then, and why this? Evolution is usually a stingy accountant. It does not pay for a trait unless the trait earns its keep, unless it helps a creature survive or find a mate or raise its young. So a trait found in only one species, costly and conspicuous, demands an explanation. And emotional tears are conspicuous. They blur your vision at the exact moments you might most need to see. When you are afraid, when you are confronting someone, when you are grieving in a dangerous world. A blurred-eyed animal is a vulnerable animal. For weeping to survive the long filter of natural selection, it must have paid for that handicap many times over with some benefit large enough to be worth the cost. One idea is that blurred vision is the whole point, that tears are a flag of surrender, a way of signaling that you are no threat, that you have laid down your weapons, that you can be approached. A person in tears is, for the moment, disarmed, and to weep in front of another is to trust them with that weakness. Tears may have begun, in part, as a bond of trust between members of a species that survives by sticking together. There is another idea, gentler and in some ways sadder. Human babies are born more helpless than the young of almost any other animal, unable to cling, unable to follow, unable to do anything for themselves for months on end, except cry, A human infant's survival depends entirely on holding the attention and the tenderness of the adults around it. Tears, on this view, may have grown out of that long dependence, a signal honed to be impossible to ignore, a way for the most helpless creature in the animal kingdom to keep the people it needs from drifting away, and perhaps the trait, once built, never switched off. Perhaps we go on weeping all our lives because the helplessness never fully ends, because there are always moments, even in the strongest adult, when we are as undefended as we were on the first day, and the body reaches for the oldest call it knows. Whatever the reason, the strangeness stands. Somewhere in the long history that shaped us, the human animal alone began to leak its feelings as water, and the trait was useful enough to keep. To get anywhere, we have to take crying apart, and it turns out a tear is not one thing but three. The first kind is always there. Right now, as you read this, a thin film of liquid coats the surface of each of your eyes, spreading fresh with every blink, keeping the eye smooth and clear and fed with oxygen. These are the quiet tears, the ones that never fall, the ones you live inside without noticing, every waking second of your life. The second kind is the rescue squad. When something gets into the eye, a speck of dust, a cut onion sting, a gust of cold wind, the eye floods on purpose, washing the threat away in a rush of water. These are the tears of reflex, fast and practical, gone as soon as the danger is. And then there is the third kind, the tears that come from the heart, the ones that arrive with feeling and only with feeling, that no speck of dust can summon and no blink can produce, that rise when you are moved and spill when you can no longer hold them. These are the ones this whole story is about. And the remarkable thing, the thing that took science a surprisingly long time to discover, is that these three kinds of tears are not even made of the same stuff. Where do they even come from, these different waters? All three are made by the same small organ, the lacrimal gland, tucked just above and to the outer side of each eye, about the size and shape of an almond. It produces fluid all day long, drop by quiet drop, but what governs it is the part that matters. The lacrimal gland answers to the branch of the nervous system that runs the body's calm, restorative functions, the same branch that slows the heart and settles the gut and lets the body rest. This is a clue that is easy to miss. The flood of emotional tears is tied to the system the body uses to come down from a height, to recover, to soothe itself. People often describe feeling spent but lighter after a long cry, wrung out and somehow cleaner, and that feeling is not imaginary. The very wiring that opens the tear gland is wired into the body's machinery for calming down. To weep, on this picture, is already to begin to heal. The crying is not only the wound, it is also, strangely, the beginning of the cure. Whether a good cry actually makes you feel better turns out to be a harder question than it sounds, and the answer reveals something about what tears are for. When researchers simply ask people to recall a crying episode, most report feeling better afterward, lighter, relieved. But when researchers watch people cry in the moment, in a laboratory, and measure their mood right after, the picture is muddier. Many feel worse immediately, not better. The relief, when it comes, tends to come later, and it depends heavily on what happens around the crying. If you weep and someone comforts you, you feel better. If you weep alone and the situation that caused it remains unresolved, you may not. This is a revealing pattern. It suggests that the relief of crying is not a simple chemical valve releasing pressure, but something that works through other people, through being seen and held and answered. The tears do their deepest work not in the eye but in the space between you and whoever responds to them. Crying is a social act even when it feels like the most private thing in the world, and its power to heal runs through connection, which is, when you think about it, exactly what the traditions always said, that weeping opens the heart, and an open heart reaches for another. That discovery belongs largely to a biochemist named William Frey, who spent years in the early 1980s at a research center in Minnesota doing something almost comically difficult, collecting human tears. He gathered reflex tears by having volunteers grate onions. He gathered emotional tears by sitting people down in front of sad films and waiting. And when he compared what he had collected, he found that emotional tears were chemically different from the tears an onion brings. The tears of feeling carried more protein. They carried higher concentrations of certain stress-related substances, including hormones the body floods itself with under emotional strain. Frey proposed an idea that was simple and startling at once, that emotional crying might be a form of release, a way the body physically carries stress chemicals out of itself, that we do not merely express sorrow when we weep, but in some literal sense, excrete it. The salt water on your cheek, in this view, is not just a signal. It is a small act of cleaning, the body washing grief out through the eyes the way it washes other things out through other means. It is worth being careful here, because this is exactly the kind of idea that can drift from science into wishful thinking. And the honest position is that Frey's release theory is suggestive rather than proven. What the chemistry shows is real. Emotional tears do carry a different mix from reflex tears, including measurable amounts of substances the body produces under stress. Among them a hormone linked to the stress response and a natural painkiller the brain releases when it is suffering. That these end up in tears is a fact. Whether crying them out actually lowers the body's burden of stress in a meaningful way, rather than simply carrying off a trace amount as a side effect, is still debated. The story is appealing. The evidence is partial, and a channel that respects its audience says so rather than overselling. But even the partial evidence points somewhere remarkable, that the water of feeling is chemically the water of stress, that when you weep from the heart you are passing out of your body the very molecules your suffering made. The grief, in some small literal measure, leaves you in the drop. Not everyone agrees that release is the main point, and the science here is still a live argument rather than a settled fact, which is worth saying plainly. The most prominent challenger to the pure release idea is a Dutch psychologist named Ad Vingerhoets at Tilburg University, who has probably studied human crying more thoroughly than anyone alive. Vingerhoets points out that emotional tears do something no other bodily fluid does. They call to other people. A tear on a face is a flag. It is visible across a room. It softens the faces of those who see it, pulls them closer, makes them gentler. Show people two photographs of the same crying face, one with the tears digitally removed, and they read the tearful version as needing help, as worthy of comfort, in a way the dry version does not. Tears, in this account, are a deeply social thing, maybe the most honest signal we have. They are hard to fake and hard to hide. They announce, without a word, that a person has reached the limit of what they can carry alone. They are how the body asks for help when speech is not enough, and how it confesses love and grief too large for language. Crying may clean us on the inside, as Frey suspected, and call others to us on the outside, as Vingerhoets argues. It is very likely doing both at once. Watch how crying changes across a life and the social story grows even stronger. A newborn cries without tears at all. The wet, tearful cry develops only in the weeks after birth, and from the start it works as a summons, the most effective sound a helpless infant has for pulling a caregiver close. Through childhood the tears come easily and often, for scraped knees and lost toys and bedtime fears. Then, in most cultures, something happens, especially to boys, who are taught to dam the flow, to swallow it, to treat tears as a thing to be ashamed of. Crying becomes, for many adults, a private act, something done behind closed doors or not at all, and the shame around it is itself a kind of evidence of how powerful and how exposing the signal is. We would not work so hard to hide a thing that meant nothing. People weep at the great hinges of life, at births and deaths and weddings and reunions, at the moments when the bonds between us are made or broken or seen with sudden clarity. Tears track connection. They rise precisely where one life touches another most deeply, and that is a strong hint about what they are for. But notice that none of this, not the chemistry, not the social signal, not the calming nerves, none of it touches the deepest puzzle, the one we started with. All of this explains what a tear does. None of it explains what a tear looks like when it dries. A signal can be any shape. A drop of stress chemicals could dry into a featureless smear and do its job just as well. There is no reason, no survival reason, no social reason, why the salt left behind by a tear should arrange itself into branching rivers and coastlines, and the fine forked structures that turn up in nebulae and lungs and lightning. That shape is not doing a job. It is not a signal or a defense or a release. It is just there, an accident of how salt and water and the chemistry of feelings settle as they dry, governed by rules that have nothing to do with crying at all. And that is precisely what makes it so strange. The function of the tear was shaped by the long pressures of survival. The form of the dried tear was shaped by something else entirely, by the same plane physics that shapes a river delta, or a frost pattern on a window, or the arms of a spiral galaxy. The biology made the tear fall, but the tear's hidden landscape was drawn by the universe, using the same pen it uses everywhere else. Before we follow that pen out into the cosmos, hold on to how much is already astonishing right here, in the plain biology of a single drop. Think of what has to happen for one emotional tear to form. A feeling arises, somewhere in the deep, old structures of the brain that handle grief and love and fear. That feeling, which weighs nothing and occupies no space, sends a signal down through the nervous system to a small gland above the eye. The gland, answering the body's calming circuitry, begins to produce fluid, drawing water and salt and protein and the chemistry of stress out of the blood. The fluid pools, rises over the lower lid, and falls. And in that fall it carries, all at once, a message to other people, a trace of the body's own distress chemicals, a wash of antibacterial defense, the salt of an ancient sea, and a structure that, on drying, will echo the largest objects in the sky. A single tear is a meeting place. The brain meets the body in it. The individual meets the species in it. The living meets the chemical in it. And the small meets the vast in it, the private grief of one person carrying, in its salt and its shape, a thread that runs all the way out to the stars. We tend to think of crying as a simple thing, almost an embarrassing thing, a small leak in our composure. It is nothing of the kind. It is one of the most layered and astonishing acts the human body performs. And what is this liquid exactly that does so much? Pull a single tear apart, and you find it is built in layers, like the atmosphere of a small planet. There is an oily outer layer that keeps the tear from evaporating too fast. There is a thick, watery middle, the bulk of the drop, carrying salts and proteins and sugars and tiny defensive enzymes that kill bacteria on contact. There is an inner layer that helps the whole thing cling to the eye. Salt is the part most people know, the taste of the sea on your lips when you cry. Sodium and chloride dissolved in water exactly as they are dissolved in the ocean and, as it happens, exactly as they are scattered through the clouds of space where stars are born. A tear is salt water with a structure, a small and complicated fluid that protects, cleans, signals, and carries the chemistry of feeling. It is one of the most ordinary things your body makes. It is also, when you look closely enough, one of the strangest. Consider just one ingredient in that drop. Your tears contain an enzyme that punctures the cell walls of bacteria, a tiny chemical weapon that helps keep the exposed surface of your eye from being colonized by the microbes drifting through every breath of air. It was one of the first natural antibacterial substances ever identified, discovered, the story goes, when a researcher with a cold let a drop from his own nose fall onto a dish of bacteria and watch them dissolve. Your tears are mildly antiseptic. They are, among everything else, a defense, washing the eye not only of dust, but of living threats. And then there is the salt. The saltiness of a tear is almost exactly the saltiness of blood, and the saltiness of blood is a faint echo of the ancient sea in which the first living cells arose, the chemistry of that early ocean still carried in the fluids of every animal that ever crawled out of it. When you taste salt on your lips as you cry, you are tasting a sea that dried up hundreds of millions of years ago, kept alive inside your own body, passed down unbroken from the first creatures to the present moment. The same salt is out among the stars, scattered through the cold clouds where new suns gather. Sodium does not care whether it is in an ocean, a tear, or a nebula. It is the same element, forged in dead stars, raining down through everything. Your grief is salted with the universe. This is not poetry stretched for effect. It is plain chemistry. Every atom of sodium in your tears was made inside a star that lived and died before the sun was born. There is no other place sodium can come from. The heavy elements that make up the salt of your sorrow were cooked in stellar furnaces, scattered when those stars exploded, gathered into the cloud that became our world, and worked, over billions of years, into the fluid that now falls from your eyes. So when you cry, you are not only producing a chemical signal or releasing a trace of stress, you are returning a little starlight to the air. The salt that the cosmos made in the hearts of dead suns is leaving your body, one drop at a time, carrying your grief out into the world it came from. The tear and the star are not merely similar, they are made of the same stuff, born of the same fire, and, as we are about to see, shaped by the same rules. Long before anyone collected tears in a laboratory or measured the hormones in them, people sensed that weeping did something to the soul as well as the body. Across the old contemplative traditions there runs a quiet, persistent intuition that tears cleanse, that they are not weakness but grace, that something is washed away in honest weeping that cannot be washed any other way. In the deserts where the early Christian monks went to pray, there grew up a whole teaching around what they called the gift of tears, weeping treated not as a thing to be ashamed of, but as a sign that the heart had softened and opened. Other traditions, as we will see, wept for love rather than sorrow, and treated the tears of devotion as something close to holy. They had no biochemistry. They had only attention, turned for centuries onto the inner life. And what they noticed, again and again, was that the salt water from the eyes was bound up with the deepest movements of the human spirit. The science is now catching up to what they felt, but that is further down the road. Think only of how many of the deepest human moments are marked by tears, and how every tradition seems to know it. The mourner at the grave, the worshipper overcome in prayer, the lover weeping at reunion. The old monk who wrote, more than 1,000 years ago, that the soul could be cleansed by tears as the body is cleansed by water, and that a day of weeping might do more than a year of dry effort. In one tradition, the saint weeps for the suffering of all living things, and her tears become a source of compassion in the world. In another, the devotee weeps from sheer love of the divine until weeping itself becomes a form of prayer, the body praying in salt when words run out. These are not idle images. They are reports, gathered across thousands of years and every continent, of a single observation, that the human being is built to weep at exactly the points where it touches what matters most, and that there is something in the weeping that heals, that opens, that connects. The traditions did not know about the lacrimal gland or the chemistry of stress hormones. They knew the thing those mechanisms produce, and they treated it as sacred. For now, stay with the drop itself. It falls. You wipe it away. And in that small, careless motion you erase a structure more intricate than you ever imagined. A layered fluid carrying the chemistry of your grief. A signal evolved to call others to your side. a fragment of the same salt that fills the seas and seeds the stars. You have been making this liquid your whole life. You made it before you could speak. You will make it until the end. And you have never once stopped to wonder why the thing your sorrow produces should be so complicated, so useful, so strangely beautiful, or why, when it dries, it should leave behind a map of rivers and coastlines that the universe seems to have drawn somewhere before. That map is where we are going next. Not the chemistry of the tear, but its shape. Because the shape is where the real mystery begins, and the shape is what ties the salt water on your face to the farthest, oldest, largest things there are. Look at it. Branching channels splitting into smaller channels, coastlines, wide deltas, opening into what looks like a sea. It could be a satellite photograph of a great river system seen from orbit, the kind of image that makes you feel how small a person is against the size of a continent. It is not a continent. It is a single tear, dried on a piece of glass and magnified under a microscope. The whole landscape is a few millimeters across, and the strange thing, the thing that stops you when you first see one of these images, is that you cannot tell. Shown the dried tear and the satellite photo side by side, with no labels, most people guess wrong. The map left behind by one drop of human feeling is, to the eye, indistinguishable from the map of a river draining half a country. Same branching, same forking, same reaching, spreading, dividing shape. So, ask the obvious thing. Why? Why would a drop of salt water, drying on a slide, arrange itself into the shape of a river? A river is carved over thousands of years by rain and gravity and rock. A tear dries in a few minutes on a flat piece of glass. They have nothing in common. One is enormous and ancient, the other tiny and gone in an afternoon. And yet they settle into the same form. And it is not only rivers. Hold the dried tear next to a photograph of the veins fanning across the back of your own hand, and the shapes rhyme. Hold it next to a bolt of lightning frozen by a fast camera, and they rhyme again. Next to the bare winter branches of an oak. Next to the cracks spreading through dried mud at the bottom of a lake bed. Next to the airways branching deep inside your lungs, the nerves spreading from your spine, the roots reaching down from a seed. The same forked, branching shape, over and over, in things that could not be more different in size or substance or age. Salt and water, rock and rain, blood and tissue, fire in the sky, they all reach for one form. You have seen it on a cold morning without ever thinking about it. Frost on a window grows in ferns and feathers, branching fronds of ice spreading across the glass overnight, each tiny tip splitting into smaller tips, a forest drawn in frost that was not there when you went to sleep. No one painted it. It assembled itself out of water vapor and cold, following the same forked instinct. A snowflake does it too, 6 arms each, carrying the same intricate branching, every flake unique, and yet every flake built on the same plan. Crack open certain rocks and you find dark, tree-like figures spread across the stone, mineral dendrites, the fossilized branching of minerals that crept through the rock ages ago, mistaken for centuries, for the imprints of ancient plants, but in truth, pure chemistry, the same shape again, grown in stone instead of ice or salt or blood. The branching tree is everywhere, in the frost and the flake and the stone and the storm, drawn by water and cold and chemistry and charge, by forces that know nothing of each other, and arrive at the same picture every time. The dried tear simply joins the gallery. It is one more place the universe drew the only shape it seems to know for spreading, reaching, and dividing. Wherever something has to branch, the universe reaches into the same small drawer and pulls out the same shape, and it does not seem to matter at all whether the thing branching is alive, or burning, or freezing, or grieving. This cannot be coincidence, and it is not. When the same shape turns up again and again in things that share no common cause, it is telling you something. It is telling you that the shape is not really about rivers or veins or lightning or tears. It is about something deeper than any of them, some rule that all of them obey without knowing it. And once you see that rule, you cannot unsee it. The world stops looking like a collection of separate things and starts looking like a single set of patterns wearing 1,000 different costumes. The river and the vein and the lightning and the tear are not copying each other. They are all answering to the same hidden instruction, written into the way matter moves and settles and flows. Find that instruction, and you find the thread that ties the salt on your face to the rivers of the earth, the storms of the sky, and, before we are done, the structure of the cosmos itself. This is a different way of seeing the world, and it takes some getting used to. We are taught to sort things by what they are made of, by what they do, by where they belong. A tear in one box and a river in another, and a galaxy in a third. Biology here, and geology there, and astronomy somewhere far away. But the pattern cuts across all of it. It does not care what a thing is made of or how big it is or whether it is alive. It cares only about what the thing has to do, how it has to move and spread and settle, and it hands out the same shape to everything facing the same task. Seen this way, the tear and the river are not distant cousins who happen to look alike. They are the same solution, printed at different sizes, in different materials, by the same indifferent laws. So let us find those laws. Let us learn why the universe keeps drawing the same picture, no matter what it is drawing on. For a long time, this kind of shape had no name, and mathematics quietly ignored it. The geometry everyone learned in school is the geometry of clean things. Straight lines, smooth circles, flat planes, neat triangles. It is beautiful and it is useful, and it describes almost nothing in nature. Clouds are not spheres, mountains are not cones, coastlines are not curves you can draw with a compass. A tree is not any shape that old geometry has a word for. The real world is rough, broken, jagged, branching, and for centuries that roughness was treated as a kind of mess, too irregular to be captured by clean equations, beneath the dignity of serious mathematics. Then, in the 1970s, a mathematician named Benoit Mandelbrot, working at a research lab rather than a university, did something simple and radical. He took the roughness seriously. He asked whether there might be a hidden order inside the messiness of the natural world, a mathematics of the jagged and the broken, and he gave the thing he found a name. He called it the fractal. He came to it through a question that sounds almost silly until you sit with it. How long is the coast of Britain? You would think you could just look it up, but the answer depends entirely on the size of your ruler. Measure the coastline with a long measuring stick, stepping over the small inlets, and you get one number. Measure it with a shorter stick that dips into those inlets, and you get a larger number. Use a stick shorter still, catching every little cove and rock, and the number grows again. The coastline does not have a single length. It gets longer the more closely you look, without limit, because there is always more detail at smaller scales, bays within bays within bays. This bothered mathematicians, who like things to have definite answers. Mandelbrot saw that it was not a flaw but a feature, the very signature of the kind of shape that fills the natural world. He even found a way to put a number on the roughness, a strange new kind of dimension that need not be a whole number at all. A smooth line is one-dimensional. A filled plane is two-dimensional. But a jagged coastline, a branching river, a crumpled fractal lives somewhere in between, with a dimension like 1.2 or 1.3, a measure of just how thoroughly it crinkles and branches to fill the space around it. The shapes of nature, it turned out, had been speaking a mathematics no one had bothered to learn, and the dried tear speaks it too. Stop and feel how odd self-similarity really is. because familiarity can dull it. In most of life, scale matters enormously. A model of a bridge built at 1/10 the size will not behave like the real bridge. An ant blown up to the size of a horse would collapse under its own weight, because strength and weight change differently as size grows. Size usually changes everything. That is what makes fractals so peculiar. A fractal is a shape that has, in a sense, escaped from scale, that looks the same whether you view it from a mile away or through a magnifying glass, that has no built-in size at all. There is no way to tell, from the shape alone, whether you are looking at something tiny or something colossal. Shown a branching fractal with no ruler beside it, you cannot say if it is a salt crystal, a hair's width across, or a network of galaxies 1,000,000,000 light years wide. The shape refuses to tell you its size, and this is exactly why the dried tear can be mistaken for a satellite image, and why a nebula can be mistaken for a frost pattern. They share a shape that has shed all sense of scale. The pattern is the same at the size of a tear and the size of a star, because the pattern, by its nature, does not know how big it is. The heart of a fractal is one idea, and it is an idea you can feel in your bones once you see it. A fractal is a shape that looks the same at every scale. Zoom in on a piece of it, and the piece looks like the whole. Zoom in again on a piece of the piece, and you find the whole shape once more, smaller, repeating. A coastline is like this. Seen from space, a coastline has bays and peninsulas. Walk down to one bay, and its edge has smaller bays and smaller peninsulas. Crouch down to a single rock at the water's edge, and its outline has the same jagged inlets again, smaller still. The pattern repeats as you go down, level after level, the small echoing the large. This is what mathematicians call self-similarity, and it is the signature of a fractal. A tree branches into boughs, the boughs branch into limbs, the limbs into twigs, each split echoing the one before. Your lungs branch the same way, the windpipe into two main airways, those into smaller and smaller tubes, more than 20 levels deep, the same forking repeated at every scale until the passages are too small to see. If you could unfold all those tiny branchings and lay the inner surface of your lungs out flat, it would cover something close to the area of a tennis court, an enormous surface, folded by fractal branching into the space of your chest. That is what the shape is for, to pack a vast reach into a small volume, to let air touch blood across an area far larger than your body could otherwise hold. The branching tree is how nature fits the immense into the small, and you carry one such tree in your chest, breathing through it now. Each branch a smaller copy of the branch above it, the same design that drains a continent compressed into the space beneath your ribs. The river splits into tributaries, the tributaries into streams, the streams into the smallest rivulets, the same branching all the way down, and the tear, drying, cracks and creeps, and crystallizes into the same forked channels, large feeding small, small feeding smaller, a fractal landscape made of salt. The list of things that branch this way is almost unsettling once you start collecting it. The nerve cells in your brain spread their dendrites in fractal fans to gather signals from thousands of neighbors. The bronchial tubes of your lungs and the blood vessels feeding them branch in matched fractal trees, air and blood reaching for each other across the thinnest of walls. Lightning forks, rivers fork. The cracks in old paint fork. Ferns unfurl in fronds made of smaller fronds made of smaller fronds. The same leaf shape nested inside itself 3 or 4 times over. The veins in a leaf carry the same design as the river that waters the tree the leaf grows on. And when astronomers map the largest structure of the universe, the way galaxies are strung through space across distances the mind cannot hold, they found that 2 arranged in branching filaments and threads, a vast web with the same reaching, dividing character as the veins in your hand. From the dendrites in a single neuron to the threads of galaxies spanning billions of light years, across a range of sizes so enormous it has no real meaning to us, the same forked signature keeps appearing. It is one of the most repeated shapes in all of nature, and it is the shape your tear leaves behind when it dries. But naming the pattern is not the same as explaining it. Why does nature keep building fractals? Why this shape, over and over, rather than 1,000 different ones? The answer turns out to be a kind of deep economy, and it is worth slowing down for, because it is the real key to the whole mystery. Branching is what you get when something has to spread through space, to reach everywhere, while spending as little as possible doing it. Think about the problem your blood vessels solve. Every single cell in your body needs to be fed, and there are tens of trillions of them. Blood has to reach all of them, which means the network of vessels has to touch essentially every point in the body. But blood is costly. The heart can only pump so much, and every extra inch of vessel is more to fill and maintain. So the body faces a hard problem: reach everywhere, using as little plumbing as possible. And the solution, found by the body without a designer, is branching. A few large vessels split into many medium ones, which split into a vast number of tiny ones, each level covering more territory with less length, until the smallest capillaries thread past every cell. There is even a mathematical rule, worked out a century ago, that describes the precise way the size of a vessel should shrink at each branch point to make the flow as efficient as possible, and your arteries obey it. The rule was found by studying the body, but it is not really about bodies at all. It is about flow, about the cheapest way to move a fluid through a branching network, and anything that has to do that job, alive or not, drifts toward the same proportions. Your circulatory system did not read the rule and follow it. It was shaped, generation by generation, by the simple fact that animals whose vessels branched efficiently survived better than animals whose vessels wasted blood and effort and efficiency, pursued blindly over millions of years, converged on the mathematics, the same mathematics that a river finds by erosion, the body found by evolution, two utterly different roads arriving at one destination, because the destination is set by the problem, not by the traveller. Now here is the thing that should make the hair stand up on your arms. A river system solves the very same problem. Rain falls across a whole landscape, and all of it has to be gathered and carried to the sea, draining every acre, while cutting as few channels as possible. The solution the water finds, with no mind and no plan, carving rock over millennia, is branching. Many small streams feeding fewer larger ones, feeding a single great river, the same shape your blood vessels make. A tree solves a version of it too. It has to spread its leaves to catch sunlight across as much area as possible, and gather what it catches back to a single trunk, with as little wood as it can manage. The solution is branching. Lightning solves a version of it, finding the most efficient path for a sudden charge to spread from cloud to ground through resisting air. The solution is branching. Over and over, in living things and dead ones, the same problem appears in different clothes, reach everywhere for the least cost, and the same answer appears in response. The branching shape is not a coincidence shared by rivers and veins and lightning and trees. It is the answer to a question that the universe keeps asking, and the answer is always the same because the question is always the same. There is an even deeper reason these shapes converge, and it shows up when you watch how they grow. Imagine particles drifting at random, wandering this way and that, and suppose that whenever one happens to bump into a growing cluster, it sticks where it lands. What grows is not a smooth blob. It is a branching, feathery, fractal structure, because the wandering particles tend to stick to the outermost tips that reach into the open, while the inner nooks stay sheltered and starved. The tips grow faster, reach further, throw off new tips, and the whole thing blossoms into a fractal tree, built purely out of randomness and a simple sticking rule. This same blind process, growth that favors the exposed tip, shapes the path of lightning through air, the spread of a crack through stone, the creep of frost across glass, the growth of certain crystals, and the dendrites of salt in a drying tear. It does not require a plan or a purpose. It requires only that growth happen at the edges, where the open space is, and the branching follows on its own. So when you see the forked map in the dried tear, you are seeing the fingerprint of one of the most basic creative processes there is. Order blooming, untended, out of randomness and a rule. And there may be a reason these shapes move us, a reason we find a branching tree or a forking river or a spreading bolt of lightning beautiful rather than merely interesting. Some researchers who study how people respond to images have found that we tend to prefer fractal patterns of a certain richness, the same degree of branching complexity found in trees, in coastlines, in clouds, the patterns our species spent its whole history living among. Faced with these shapes, people report feeling calmer. Some measurements suggest the body itself relaxes, the stress easing, as if the eye were coming home to a kind of pattern it was built to read. If that is right, then it closes a quiet circle. We weep, and the tear dries into a fractal. And fractals are the very shapes that soothe us, that the human nervous system finds restful and right. The map your grief leaves behind belongs to the same family of patterns that calm a troubled mind. There may be no deep meaning in that, or there may be more than we know. Either way, the branching shape is woven through us at every level, in the lungs we breathe with, the vessels we live by, the nerves we think with, the patterns we find beautiful, and the salt our sorrow leaves on the glass. And the tear, when a drop of salt water dries, it faces its own version of this. As the water evaporates, the salt and proteins left behind have to go somewhere, carried by tiny currents within the shrinking drop, settling and crystallizing as the liquid retreats. Salt does not crystallize into smooth blobs. It grows in fingers, in fronds, in dendrites, each growing tip throwing off smaller tips, the same branching reflex that builds a snowflake's arms. The drying drop also pulls its contents outward in a way that leaves the famous ring you have seen 1,000 times in a dried coffee stain, denser at the edges, structured within. The reason is a small piece of physics that took a surprisingly long time to understand. When a drop sits on a surface and begins to dry, its edge tends to get pinned in place, stuck where it first landed. But evaporation is fastest at that pinned edge, so to keep the edge supplied, liquid flows outward from the center, carrying salt and protein and everything dissolved in it toward the rim. By the time the drop is dry, much of its cargo has been swept to the edges and deposited there, leaving the telltale ring and a whole inner geography of currents frozen in place. Inside that geography, as the last water leaves, the salt crystallizes in its branching dendrites and the residue cracks as it shrinks. 3 different processes: the outward flow, the branching crystals, the shrinking cracks, overlap and combine, and out of their interplay comes the intricate landscape that so resembles a coast seen from space. It is pure physics, every step of it, the same physics that would act on any drying drop of salty water anywhere in the universe. Add the cracks that form as the residue shrinks and pulls apart, splitting like dried mud, and you get a landscape, branching salt crystals, settling currents, shrinking cracks, all governed by the plain physics of evaporation and crystallization and flow. No one designs the map in the tear. It builds itself, out of the same handful of rules that build a snowflake, a frost fern on a winter window, a mineral dendrite in a cracked rock. The tear is not imitating a river. It is obeying the same laws, and the laws, given salt and water and a surface to dry on, draw what they always draw. We know what these dried tears look like because an artist spent years photographing them. She began by chance, weeping during a hard passage of her own life, and on a whim she caught a few tears, let them dry, and looked at them under a microscope. What she saw astonished her, and she kept going, eventually photographing 100 or more. Tears of grief, tears of joy, tears of laughter, tears from cutting onions, each dried and magnified and captured as a tiny landscape. The images looked like aerial photographs of the Earth, or like deep space pictures of distant clouds, sweeping vistas that fit on the head of a pin. And she noticed something that no one had expected. The tears did not all look the same. A tear of grief did not, in general, dry into the same landscape as a tear of joy or a tear from an onion. The chemistry differs, as we saw, the proportions of salt and protein and hormone shifting with the feeling that produced the tear, and that different chemistry crystallizes into a different map. The shape of the dried tear carries a trace of the emotion that made it. The grief writes one landscape. The laughter writes another. Your feeling, in some literal sense, leaves its signature in the salt, a tiny terrain shaped by what you felt as you wept. The map in the tear is not generic. It is, faintly, yours. People sensed this long before there was a mathematics of it. There is an old idea, older than science, that the small mirrors the large, that the human being is a tiny model of the whole cosmos, that the patterns of the heavens are repeated in the patterns of the earth and the body. As above, so below, runs an ancient phrase, the conviction that the same design runs through every level of the world, from the grandest to the smallest, that to understand one is to glimpse the others. It was, for most of history, a mystical intuition, a feeling without proof. The mathematics of fractals has, without meaning to, given that old feeling a hard and literal backbone. The same shapes really do run through every scale of nature. The pattern in your lungs really is the pattern in the river and the tree and the lightning. The small really does echo the large, not as poetry but as plain fact, because the same rules really are at work everywhere. The ancients guessed it. The mathematics proved it. It runs through more than one tradition. This hunch that the pattern of the whole is folded into every part. The old idea of the microcosm held that the human being is a world in miniature, that the same order which arranges the heavens arranges the body, that a person is the cosmos written small. In the sacred diagrams of more than one culture, in the mandalas and the great rose windows and the geometric figures drawn for meditation, you find the same instinct expressed in form, a pattern that repeats from the center outward, the small echoing the large, the part holding the shape of the whole. The people who made these things were not doing mathematics. They were paying close attention to the world and to themselves, and they kept arriving at the same conviction that reality is built in nested layers that rhyme with one another, that nothing is truly separate because the same design runs through everything. They could not have known about fractal dimension or self-similar growth, but they had noticed the thing those ideas describe. And the proof, when it finally came, pointed exactly where their intuition had always pointed, upward, to the sky. Because if the same shapes run through all of nature, then they should run through the stars as well. That is the question waiting at the edge of this one. We have seen that the map in the tear is the map of the river, the vein, the tree, the lightning, drawn by the same rules of branching and flow that nature uses everywhere it has to spread through space. We have seen that the shape is not a coincidence but an answer. The universe solving the same problem the same way at every scale it works on. But the scales we have looked at so far are all close to home, the size of a body, a tree, a storm, a continent. The real test, the one that would tie your grief to the cosmos itself, is whether the same rules reach all the way up to the clouds, where stars are born, and the great structures that span the sky. Does the universe build a nebula the way it builds a tear? Is a dying star shaped by the same hand that shapes the salt on your face? Think about what it would mean if the answer is yes. It would mean that when you weep, the salt water on your face is not just chemically related to the stars sharing their sodium, but shaped by the same hand that shapes them, drawn into the same form by the same deep rules. It would mean that grief and starlight are not two unrelated things that happen to share a few atoms, but two expressions of one underlying order, the universe drawing its single favourite shape, once in a cloud of cosmic gas, and once in the tear of a grieving person. The same picture at scales separated by a gulf the mind cannot cross. The dried tear on the slide and the nebula in the telescope would be, in the most literal sense the science allows, made by the same process. Your sorrow would carry, in its hidden landscape, a genuine echo of the structure of the heavens, not as a comforting metaphor but as a fact of physics. That is the claim we are testing. That is where we go next, out past the earth, into the largest things there are, to see whether the map in the tear is also the map of the heavens. The pattern is the thread. We have followed it from the eye to the river. Now we follow it to the stars. Right now, somewhere above your head, a star is being born, not as a sudden flash, not all at once, but slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, in a place colder and darker and emptier than anywhere on Earth. Picture it. A vast cloud of gas drifting between the stars, light years across, so thin that by any earthly standard it would count as a near-perfect vacuum, so cold that it sits just a few degrees above the lowest temperature anything can reach. Mostly hydrogen, the simplest stuff there is, with a little dust mixed in. For ages, millions of years, the cloud just hangs there in the dark, going nowhere, doing nothing. And then, somewhere inside it, the gas begins to gather. A region grows a little denser than its surroundings. Its own gravity pulls in more gas, which makes it denser still, which pulls in more, and the gathering feeds on itself, faster and faster, until at the heart of that cold, dark cloud, a knot of matter is collapsing inward under its own weight, heating as it falls, until the center grows so hot and so crushed that hydrogen begins to fuse, and a new sun catches fire. Along the way, the falling gas does something beautiful. Because the original cloud was turning, however slowly, the collapsing knot spins faster and faster as it shrinks. The way a skater pulls in her arms and speeds her spin, and the spinning flattens the infalling gas into a whirling disk around the new star. Out of that disk, in many cases, planets will later gather, worlds condensing from the leftover material the way the star condensed from the cloud. So the same collapse that lights a star also lays down the disk that builds its planets, all of it one continuous process, gas falling, spinning, flattening, gathering, from cloud to star to world. Our own sun and earth were made this way, 4.5 billion years ago, out of a collapsing knot in some long-vanished cloud. The ground you stand on is the settled dust of that disk. You are standing on the leftovers of a star's birth. Out of a cold, formless cloud, a star. It is happening constantly, all over the galaxy, all over the universe. In our own galaxy alone, a few new stars are born every year, on average, somewhere in its great spiral arms. Each one, a slow miracle of gathering and collapse playing out over an age longer than humans have existed. The light from the nearest star nurseries left them thousands of years ago, and is only now reaching our telescopes, so that when we look at a glowing cloud where stars are forming, we are seeing a baby picture, a portrait of a birth that finished long before anyone alive was born. The universe is a vast and patient nursery, lighting new suns in the dark without pause, and it has been doing so for nearly 14 billion years, since not long after the beginning of time itself. Every star you have ever seen, every star anyone has ever seen, was born this way, out of a cold cloud pulling itself together in the dark. How does that happen? How does a thin, shapeless cloud of gas turn itself into something as ordered as a star, a perfect glowing sphere that will burn steadily for billions of years? Where does the order come from? You might think the universe runs the other way, toward mess, toward cooling and spreading and falling apart, and in the long run it does. Yet here is a cloud of nothing in particular pulling itself together into a sun. And there is a second question, stranger than the first, the one that brought us out here in the first place. When astronomers look closely at these clouds where stars are born, at the great glowing nurseries of gas the telescopes reveal, they do not see smooth, featureless fog. They see structure. They see the cloud carved into long, winding filaments, threads of denser gas branching and weaving through the dark, splitting into smaller threads, gathering into knots where new stars ignite. They see, in other words, the same branching, forking, dividing shape we have been following all along, the same shape as the river, the same shape as the vein, the lightning, the dried tear on the glass, out at the scale of light years, in clouds that could swallow 1,000 solar systems. The universe is drawing the same picture it draws in the salt of your sorrow. Stop and let that settle, because it is the heart of everything. The map your tear leaves behind when it dries is a map of branching channels. The clouds where stars are born are shaped into branching filaments. The shapes match, not loosely, not as a stretch, but in the precise mathematical sense we have been building toward, the same kind of forking structure, repeating at smaller and smaller scales, the signature of the same hidden rules. A tear is a few millimeters of drying salt water. A star-forming cloud is trillions of miles of cold gas. Between them lies a gap in size so enormous that no comparison can hold it. A gap of such scale that the tear and the cloud have, on the face of it, nothing whatever to do with each other, and they are shaped alike. The question is whether that is an accident, a meaningless rhyme between the very small and the very large, or whether the same laws really do reach across that impossible gap and draw the same form at both ends of it. To answer that, we have to understand how the order of a star comes to be at all. But let us be careful and honest from the start, because this is exactly the kind of resemblance that can be oversold, and a story worth telling does not need to cheat. The fact that a tear and a nebula share a branching shape does not mean a tear is a tiny nebula, or that crying connects you to the stars by some hidden force, or that there is a mystical energy flowing between your sorrow and the sky. There is not, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What the shared shape means is narrower and, properly understood, more interesting than any of that. It means that the same physical principles, the same mathematics of branching and flow and self-organization govern matter at every scale, and that when very different things face the same kind of physical problem, they arrive at the same kind of form. The tear and the nebula are not connected. They are alike because they obey the same laws. That is the honest claim, and it is enough. We do not need to inflate it into something false to feel its weight. So with that clear, we can ask the real question without fear of fooling ourselves. How does the universe build something out of almost nothing? And why, when it does it keep reaching for the branching shape? Begin with gravity, the patient sculptor of everything large. Gravity is weak. It is by far the feeblest of the forces that run the universe. So weak that the tiny magnets on your refrigerator overpower the pull of the entire earth beneath them. But gravity has two advantages that make it the master of the cosmos at large scales. It never tires, and it never cancels out. Every scrap of matter pulls on every other scrap, always, and the pulls only ever add up, never subtract. Given enough matter and enough time, gravity always wins. And what it builds, given a cloud of gas, is a collapse. A cloud held up against its own gravity is balanced on a knife's edge. the outward push of its warmth and motion against the inward pull of its weight. Tip that balance by a passing shockwave, by the cloud cooling a little, by the blast of a nearby star dying, and a region begins to fall inward. And here is the crucial thing, the thing that makes the branching shape. The cloud does not collapse all at once as a single smooth ball. It breaks into pieces as it falls. Denser knots collapse faster than the thinner gas around them, and those knots break into smaller knots that collapse faster still. The cloud fragmenting into a hierarchy of clumps within clumps within clumps, each scale echoing the one above. A single cloud can give birth not to one star but to hundreds, born together in a cluster, because the collapse fractures into nested fragments, the same nesting, the same self-similar breaking that builds a fractal anywhere else. This is not a loose impression. When astronomers measure the structure of these clouds carefully, mapping how the gas is distributed across scales, they find that it has a fractal character in the strict mathematical sense, the same density of detail repeating from the largest scales down to the smallest they can resolve. The clouds between the stars are built like coastlines and like the dried tear, rough at every scale, branching within branching. Some surveys put a number on it, a fractal dimension for the interstellar gas not far from the values found for clouds in our own sky and for the branching of a river network on the ground. The matter from which stars are made is arranged, across light years, by the same kind of pattern that arranges the salt in a drying drop across millimeters, and the timescales are as staggering as the sizes. The cloud may drift for millions of years before anything happens. The collapse of a single star takes 100,000 years or more, and the star it makes will then burn for millions or billions of years before it dies and returns its matter to the dark, to gather again into new clouds and new stars. The tear dries in minutes. The star takes an age of the world, and the same shape governs both. And the gas does not fall in silence or in order, it churns. The clouds between the stars are stirred by turbulence, by the winds of dying stars and the slow shearing of the galaxies turning, and that turbulence ripples through the gas at every scale at once, great swirls breaking into smaller swirls breaking into smaller ones. Still, the same cascade you see in a fast river or a rising column of smoke. Turbulence is itself a fractal process, a churning that repeats its pattern from the largest eddies down to the smallest, and it is turbulence, working on the collapsing gas, that draws the cloud out into those long winding filaments the telescopes find. The threads of a star-forming cloud are turbulence made visible, the cloud's own churning frozen into structure, gathering gas along the filaments the way debris gathers in the lines of a stirred pool. Gravity pulls the gas together, turbulence shapes how it gathers, and between them they carve the cloud into the branching filamentary web in which the densest threads, where filaments cross and gas piles up, become the cradles where stars are lit. There is a famous little verse that scientists who study turbulence like to quote about how big whirls make little whirls that feed on their velocity, and little whirls make lesser whirls, and so on down. It captures something true and strange. Turbulence is a cascade, energy poured in at the largest scale and handed down, eddy to smaller eddy, until at the very smallest scale it finally turns to heat and fades. At every step the same churning repeats, the same swirling broken into smaller swirling, which is exactly why turbulence is a fractal and why it stamps a fractal structure onto everything it touches. The smoke rising from a candle is calm at first, then breaks into curls, then into smaller curls, the cascade made visible in a few inches of air. The same cascade, running through clouds light years wide for millions of years, draws those clouds out into their branching filaments. So the shape of a star-forming cloud is, in part, the frozen record of a turbulent cascade, the same kind of cascade you can watch in rising smoke or in the swirl of cream poured into coffee, scaled up beyond imagining and written across the sky in gas and dust. If you have ever seen the most famous photographs taken by the great space telescopes, you have seen this with your own eyes, though you may not have known what you were looking at. There is one image, perhaps the most famous astronomical picture ever made, of towering columns of gas and dust rising against a glowing background. Light years tall, their tops sculpted into branching fingers and knots. They have been called the pillars of creation, and the name is apt, because inside those columns, at this moment, new stars are forming out of the collapsing gas. Look at the shape of them, the way the great columns split at their crowns into smaller spires, the way denser knots stud their lengths, the way the whole structure forks and reaches. It is the branching shape again, sculpted in clouds, taller than the distance light travels in years. Other images show whole nebulae laced with glowing threads, dark rivers of dust winding across fields of light, bright filaments branching like the veins of some enormous leaf. We have grown so used to these pictures as backdrops, as desktop wallpaper, that we have stopped seeing what they show. They show the universe building stars, and they show it using the same forked, branching, self-similar design that it uses to drain a continent, to feed a body, and to dry a tear. And these clouds are not only nurseries, they're also graveyards, and the two are the same place. The gas that forms new stars is, in large part, the wreckage of old ones. When a massive star dies, it does not simply wink out. It explodes, blasting the elements it forged in its core, the carbon, the oxygen, the iron, the sodium, out into space, enriching the clouds around it, seeding them with the heavy atoms that did not exist when the universe began. Those scattered elements gather into new clouds, which collapse into new stars, which live and die, and scatter their own enrichment in turn, a cycle of death and birth running for billions of years. The sodium in your tears came through this cycle. It was made in a dying star, flung into a cloud, gathered into the cloud that became our sun and earth, and worked at last into the salt water of your eyes. So when you look at one of these glowing clouds and see the branching filaments where stars are born, you are looking at the kind of place your own atoms came from, shaped by the kind of process that shaped you, drawn into the same forms that your body wears. The nebula is not just shaped like you. In a real and literal sense, the nebula is where you were made. But we still have not answered the deepest question, the one that should be nagging at you. The universe, on the whole, is supposed to run down. Everything tends toward disorder, toward cooling, spreading, mixing, decaying. A hot cup of coffee cools to room temperature and never spontaneously heats back up. A sandcastle crumbles and never reassembles itself. This relentless slide toward disorder is one of the deepest laws in all of physics. So how, in a universe sliding toward mess, do you get a star? How do you get the exquisite order of a glowing sphere, or a branching filament, or a living body, or the intricate map in a tear? Where does any order come from, if everything is supposed to be falling apart? The answer, worked out across the 20th century and crowned by the work of a chemist named Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize for it in 1977, is one of the most beautiful and least known ideas in science. Order does not violate the slide toward disorder. Order feeds on it. Whenever energy flows through a system, whenever heat or matter pours in at one place and drains out at another, the system can spontaneously organize itself, building local order by speeding up the overall slide toward disorder. Prigogine called these self-built patterns dissipative structures because they live on the flow of energy through them, on dissipation, and they vanish the moment the flow stops. The idea quietly resolves a paradox that troubled thinkers for a long time. If the universe is sliding toward disorder, how can it be so full of order, of stars and galaxies and crystals and living things of breathtaking intricacy? For a while it seemed that life and order were somehow swimming against the current of physics. a local rebellion against the law of decay. Prigogine showed they are nothing of the kind. Order does not fight the slide toward disorder, it rides it. A star pours out far more disorder into the cold of space than the order it gathers into itself. A living body produces far more waste heat and entropy than the exquisite order it maintains within. The books always balance, and they balance in disorder's favour. But in the balancing, in the great flow from order to disorder, eddies of structure form and persist, the way a whirlpool forms in a draining tub, a knot of order that exists only because the water is rushing past it toward the drain. The whole bright, structured, living universe is a set of such eddies in the great draining of energy toward the dark. Nothing here lasts. Every star will burn out, every body will fail, every tear will dry. The order is always borrowed, held for a while against the current and then surrendered back to it. But while the energy flows, the patterns hold, and they are real, and they are everywhere. Stars are eddies. You are an eddy. The tear, drying, is the briefest eddy of all, and every one of them, to spread its flow, reaches for the branching shape. You have seen one in a pot of water on the stove. Heat a shallow pan of liquid gently from below, and at first nothing happens. The heat simply seeps upward. But turn it up, push the flow of heat hard enough, and all at once the liquid organizes itself, breaking into a neat array of rolling cells, an orderly honeycomb of circulating currents that was not there a moment before, and that appears, as if by magic, the instant the flow of heat crosses a threshold. No one arranged the cells. They built themselves, out of the flowing heat, order precipitating out of the push of energy through the liquid. Stranger still are certain chemical mixtures that, when the right reactions are driven hard enough, do not simply settle into a uniform colour, but begin to pulse, sweeping through cycles of colour in rhythmic waves, spiralling outward in patterns that look uncannily alive, order in time as well as in space, all of it emerging spontaneously from a flask of churning chemistry. For a long time, chemists refused to believe the early reports, certain that a self-organizing chemical clock must be some error because it seemed to defy the law of decay. It does not. It is another dissipative structure, another eddy of order living on a flow of chemical energy, and when the energy runs out, the pulsing stops and the mixture goes still and uniform at last. These patterns, the rolling cells in the heated pan, the spiraling waves in the flask, the filaments in the cloud, the branching crystals in the tear, are all members of one family. The spontaneous patterns that matter falls into when energy pours through it. Nature did not have to be this way. It is a deep and somewhat mysterious fact about our universe that driven matter organizes itself at all, that flow gives rise to form. But it does, reliably, everywhere, and the forms it reaches for are the branching, spiraling, cellular shapes we keep meeting wherever we look. This is the secret of how the universe makes order in a world sliding toward disorder. A star is a dissipative structure, a knot of order sustained by the colossal flow of energy from its fusing core out into the cold of space. A star-forming cloud organizes itself into filaments and knots as gravitational energy pours through it. A hurricane, a living cell, a forest, a human body, all of them are patterns built and held by energy flowing through, all of them order feeding on the universe's slide toward disorder. And the tear, drying, is a tiny one of these too, its branching salt crystals precipitating as the energy of evaporation drives water out of the drop. The same principle, at every scale, push energy through matter, and matter organizes itself, reaching, almost always, for the branching, forking, self-similar shapes that spread that energy most efficiently through space. It is worth seeing how directly this touches you, because it is not an abstraction happening only in distant clouds. The order of your own body, every cell of it, is paid for by a flow of energy that begins in a star. Sunlight pours onto the earth, energy arriving in a concentrated, ordered form, and it leaves again, radiated back into space as scattered heat, far more disordered than it came. In the gap between the ordered light that arrives and the disordered heat that departs, life builds itself. Plants catch the incoming light and use its flow to assemble themselves and to make the food that powers nearly everything else alive. You are, at this moment, a dissipative structure running on starlight, an eddy of order held together by a river of energy that started in the heart of the sun 8 minutes ago, or in some older star billions of years ago. The same flow that lights the sky lights you. The branching trees of your lungs and blood vessels, the forked structure of your nerves, the very architecture of your body, are shapes that a flow of stellar energy organized matter into, here, on this planet, over billions of years. You are not separate from the process that makes stars. You are one of its products, built by the same flow of energy, shaped into the same branching forms. The oldest stories humans told about the beginning of things sensed this, in their way, long before there was any physics of it. Again and again, across cultures that never met, the creation stories open the same way. In the beginning there was chaos, a formless dark, a churning deep without shape or order. And out of that chaos order arose, light separated from darkness, the waters from the dry land, form drawn out of the formless. The tellers of those stories were not doing science, but they had looked at the world and felt, correctly, that order is something that emerges out of chaos rather than something that was simply always there, that the shaped and the structured are drawn out of the shapeless and the wild. The physics of dissipative structures says something startlingly close. That order is not the default, not a given, but something that arises, again and again, wherever energy flows through chaos, drawn out of disorder by the flow itself. The cloud is the formless deep, the flowing energy of gravity is the dividing word, and the star is the light, called out of the dark. One of those old accounts begins with a wind moving over a formless, watery dark, and then a word, and then light, and the light divided from the darkness. Another tells of a golden seed or egg floating in the cosmic waters, out of which the ordered world unfolds, another of order patiently drawn from a churning chaos by a shaping power. The details differ wildly, as you would expect of stories told by people scattered across the whole earth, but the bones are the same. Before order, chaos. Before form, the formless deep. And then, somehow, the drawing out of structure from the shapeless, light from dark, world from waters. These were guesses, made by people watching campfires and rivers and the night sky, with no instruments but their own attention. And yet they fixed on the one thing that the physics of dissipative structures 3,000 years later would confirm. That order is not simply given but emerges, drawn out of disorder, again and again, wherever the conditions are right. The storytellers could never have known the mechanism, but they had felt the shape of the truth, that the structured world is something called forth from a formless deep, the same drama that plays out in the cold gas between the stars. There is a kind of vertigo in following this all the way down, or all the way up. You began with the smallest, most personal thing imaginable, a tear on your own cheek, the private overflow of your own grief. And by following its hidden shape, the branching map it leaves when it dries, you have been led step by step to the largest and most impersonal things there are, the clouds where stars are born, the flow of energy through the cosmos, the emergence of order from chaos that has run since the beginning of time. And what you find at the end of that journey is not that the tear is unimportant against the size of the stars, but the opposite. That the same laws run through both, that the tear and the star are kin, made of the same matter, shaped by the same rules, members of the same family of patterns, that the universe draws, wherever energy flows through chaos. The smallness of the tear does not separate it from the vastness of the stars. It joins it to them. The same hand drew both. So here is where we stand, out at the edge of the largest things there are. We have followed one shape, the branching, forking, self-similar shape, from the salt of a dried tear all the way to the clouds where stars are born. And we have found it at every scale between, in rivers and veins and lightning and lungs, and now in filaments of gas light years long. We have learned why the shape repeats, because it is the answer to a problem the universe keeps facing, how to spread energy and matter through space, and because order itself arises wherever energy flows through chaos, reaching for the forms that spread, that flow most efficiently. The tear and the nebula are not copies of each other. They are two answers to the same question, written by the same laws at scales so far apart the mind cannot hold them both. And that, at last, is something close to a real answer to the strange fact we began with, the resemblance between the map in the tear and the map of the heavens. It is not coincidence. It is not mysticism. It is the same physics, drawing the same shape in the salt of your grief and in the gas of a dying star. But knowing how the universe draws that shape is not the same as knowing what it means that it does, that you are built from the same patterns as the stars, that your sorrow wears the shape of the cosmos. For that, we have to turn from the how to the why it matters, from the laws to the long human attempt to make sense of our strange kinship with the sky. That is where we go next. For thousands of years, people saved their tears. Across the ancient world, from the lands around the Mediterranean to the deserts of the Middle East, archaeologists keep finding the same small object buried in old graves. A tiny glass or clay vial, slender-necked, just big enough to fit in a closed hand. For a long time, no one was sure what they were for. The best guess, and an old tradition behind it, is that they were tear bottles, vessels made to catch and keep the tears wept for the dead, the grief of the mourners gathered up as something too precious to let fall to the ground and vanish. Whether or not every such vial held tears, the idea behind the belief is what matters, and it is astonishing. These were people who looked at the salt water running down a grieving face and thought, that is worth keeping. That should be saved, sealed, carried, treasured, not wiped away and forgotten, held, like something holy. Why would anyone think that? Why would grief in liquid form strike people, again and again, across cultures that never met, as something sacred rather than something to be hidden? We do not bottle our sweat. We do not treasure our other fluids, but tears, across the whole human story, have been treated as different, set apart, holy. The old scriptures of more than one people speak of a God who counts human tears, who collects them, who keeps them in a vessel, or writes them in a book, as if every tear that ever fell were precious enough to be recorded by heaven itself. Monks in the desert prized weeping above almost any other spiritual gift. Mystics wept until weeping became their prayer. Saints were said to have wept rivers for the suffering of the world. And ordinary people, at every funeral and every wedding and every reunion in every age, have felt without being told that the tears rising in them were connected somehow to the deepest and highest things, to love, to loss, to the divine, to whatever it is that gives a life its meaning. The traditions did not have a science of tears. They had something else, the long, patient, accumulated attention of thousands of years turned onto the inner life. And what that attention found, over and over, was that the salt water from the eyes was bound up with the holiest movements of the human heart. Think about how unlikely that convergence is. These traditions grew up in different places, spoke different languages, worshipped differently, disagreed about almost everything that human beings can disagree about. The nature of God, the shape of the afterlife, the right way to live, the meaning of the world, they argued, sometimes violently, across every border. And yet on this one small point they quietly agreed, without ever coordinating, without ever meeting, that tears are sacred, that the weeping heart is closer to the truth than the dry one, that there is something in honest weeping that cleanses and opens and connects. When people who agree on nothing else agree on one thing, it is worth asking why. Either it is a coincidence, the same accident occurring independently across the whole human family, or it is a recognition, many separate observers, all noticing the same real feature of the same real thing. And the longer you look at it, the harder it becomes to believe it is a coincidence. The traditions agreed about tears, because tears really are what the traditions said they are. Here is what makes this worth a whole turning of our story. We have just spent a long time learning what science has discovered about tears, that emotional tears carry the chemistry of feeling and may help carry stress out of the body, that they are a signal evolved to call others to our side, that the very wiring that produces them is tied to the body's machinery for calming and healing, that the shape they leave when they dry is the same shape the universe draws in rivers and lightning and the clouds where stars are born. All of that is recent, the work of the last few decades, measured in laboratories, and almost every piece of it was sensed in another language by the traditions thousands of years before any instrument existed to confirm it. They said, tears cleanse. The science finds that they may literally carry stress chemistry out of the body. They said tears open the heart to others. The science finds that they are a bond, a call, the most honest signal we have. They treated weeping as a meeting point between the human being and something vast beyond it. And the science finds that the tear is shaped by the same laws that shape the stars. The traditions were not doing physics or biochemistry, but what they felt, again and again, was true. So let us listen to what they actually said. Nowhere was weeping examined more closely than among the early Christian monks who went out into the deserts of Egypt and Syria to pray, and who left behind, in their sayings and writings, one of the most remarkable bodies of reflection on tears that any tradition has produced. They spoke of something they called the gift of tears, and they did not mean ordinary crying. They meant a particular kind of weeping that arose in prayer, a softening of the hard heart, a melting that came, they believed, as grace, as a gift from beyond rather than a thing one could simply produce by trying. A monk who received the gift of tears was thought to have crossed a threshold. One of the greatest of these writers, a 7th century abbot, whose work on the stages of the spiritual life was read for centuries, devoted a whole step of his ladder to mourning and tears, and called the tears that come in genuine prayer a second baptism, a washing of the soul deeper than the water of the first. Another, a Syrian bishop of the same century renowned for his gentleness, taught that there is a clear sign by which a person knows the inner life has truly begun. The eyes fill with tears and continue to fill, and the weeping becomes almost constant, a sign that the heart has softened and the soul has woken. Tears, for these men, were not weakness and not mere sorrow. They were the water in which the soul is reborn. The sayings these desert monks left behind returned to weeping again and again, treating it almost as the central work of the spiritual life. One old monk, asked how a person should live, answered simply that one should weep, that there is no other way. Another taught that the soul which has not wept has not yet truly begun. They spoke of a sorrow that was not despair but its opposite, a tender grief over one's own hardness and the suffering of the world that softened the heart and drew it toward the good, a weeping they considered so valuable that they feared its absence more than almost any other lack. To lose the gift of tears, for them, was a kind of spiritual drought, a sign that the heart had hardened again. And they noticed, with the precision of people who watched their own souls for a living, that the tears which came in genuine prayer left a person not drained and bitter, but strangely light, washed, opened, more able to love. They had no word for the parasympathetic nervous system or the chemistry of stress, but they had found, by pure attention, the same thing the science now points to, that there is a weeping that heals, that leaves the one who weeps cleaner and softer than before, and that this healing weeping is among the most precious things a human being can be given. Sit with how exactly this matches what the science now suggests. The monks said the gift of tears washes the soul, that something is cleansed in weeping that cannot be cleansed any other way. The biochemistry finds that emotional tears carry out of the body the very molecules that stress and suffering produce, that to weep is, in some small literal measure, to excrete grief. The monks said the gift of tears softens the hard heart, opens it, makes it tender. The psychology finds that weeping is a bond, a call to others, a softening of the face that draws comfort near, and that its deepest relief comes not alone but through being received by another. The monks could not have known the chemistry of stress hormones or the social science of the crying signal. They knew only what they observed in themselves and each other across generations of close attention. That honest weeping cleanses and opens the human being in a way nothing else does. They were describing, in the language of grace and the soul, the same thing the laboratories would later describe in the language of hormones and bonding. The teaching and the data point at one reality, seen from inside and from outside, and the conviction runs back to the very beginning of the Christian story. Among the sayings at its heart is the blessing on those who mourn, the promise that they shall be comforted, weeping named not as a curse but as a state close to blessing. The tradition remembered a woman who wept at the feet of her teacher and washed them with her tears and was forgiven much because she had loved much, her tears the very sign and vehicle of her love. It remembered its greatest theologian of the inner life weeping as he came to his turning point, and weeping again at the death of his mother, who had herself, the story goes, watered years of prayer for her son with her tears. Through the whole tradition runs a single thread, that tears are not to be despised, that the softened, weeping heart is closer to God than the hard and dry one, that there is a holiness in honest weeping that the proud and tearless miss. Blessed are those who mourn. The hard heart cannot weep, the soft heart cannot stop. And the whole of the inner path, for this tradition, could be described as the slow softening of a heart, hard enough to have forgotten how. The greatest spiritual autobiography of the early Christian world turns, at its hinge, on tears. Its author describes the long agony of his resistance, the years of running from the change he knew he needed, and then the moment of breaking, when he threw himself down beneath a tree in a garden and wept, the tears pouring out of him as the old hardness finally gave way, and in that flood something turned and his life changed course. He wept again years later, at the deathbed of his mother, who had followed him across the sea and prayed for him through all his wandering, watering her hope with her own tears for decades. He was almost ashamed of how much he wept for her, and then he forgave himself the tears, recognizing that there was no dishonor in weeping for a love like that. Throughout his account, tears mark the deepest moments, the points where the hard shell of the self cracks and something truer comes through. He had no theory of the parasympathetic nervous system, but he knew from the inside that weeping was bound up with the most profound changes a human being can undergo, that the soul softened in tears in a way it could not while dry, that the breaking of the heart in honest weeping was, somehow, also its healing. Move east, and the tears change their meaning, but lose none of their depth. In the Buddhist world, the most exalted tears are not for one's own sorrow, but for the suffering of all living things. At the center of the Buddhist heart stands the figure of boundless compassion, the being who looks upon the suffering of the world and is moved by it, who hears the cries of all who suffer and turns toward them. There is a story, told in the Tibetan tradition, about this great compassionate one gazing out across the endless suffering of beings, lifetime after lifetime, realm after realm, and weeping at the sheer immensity of it, the ocean of pain that never empties no matter how many are helped. And from those tears of compassion, the story says, a saviour was born, a gentle figure who springs from the weeping of the compassionate one to carry his work into the world. Compassion itself in this telling weeps, and from its weeping comes help for the suffering. The tear is not weakness here either. It is the very form that boundless compassion takes, the overflow of a heart that has opened wide enough to feel the pain of all that lives. There is a teaching attributed to the Buddha that strikes the same chord from another direction. Across the countless lives a being is said to wander through the round of birth and death. The Buddha is remembered as saying, "The tears that being has shed, weeping over loss and grief and separation, are greater than the waters of the four great oceans." It is a staggering image, the accumulated grief of a soul's long journey outweighing all the seas of the world, and it is meant to wake the listener, to convey the depth of the suffering that the spiritual path exists to heal. But notice what it assumes, that tears are the truest measure of suffering, the very substance in which a being's sorrow can be weighed. To count the tears is to count the pain, and the response the tradition asks for is not to harden against that ocean of grief, but to open to it, to let it become compassion, to weep with all that suffers, rather than wall oneself away. The Buddhist path does not ask you to stop the tears, it asks you to widen them until they are no longer only for yourself, but for everything that lives and suffers and dies. The narrow tear of private grief becomes the wide tear of universal compassion, and that widening is the whole of the path. This is a different and in some ways more demanding vision of tears than the Western one. It does not ask only that you weep for your own losses and be cleansed. It asks that you let your weeping expand until it takes in the losses of all beings, that you refuse the easy comfort of numbness and keep your heart open to a sea of suffering that has no bottom. The great vow at the center of this path, to seek freedom not for oneself alone but for the sake of every living thing, is in a sense a vow to keep weeping, to never close the heart against the pain of others, no matter how vast that pain proves to be. And yet this is not a counsel of despair. The point of opening to the ocean of suffering is not to drown in it, but to transform it, to let the grief become compassion and the compassion become action, help flowing out to others, the way the Saviour in the story flows out of the compassionate one's tears. The weeping is a gateway. On the far side of it is not collapse, but a heart wide enough to hold the world. The tradition asks you to walk through your tears, not around them, and promises that what waits on the other side is not more sorrow but a love without limit. In the Hindu world, and especially in its great traditions of devotion, tears take on yet another colour, brighter than sorrow, the tears of love. The path of bhakti, of passionate devotion to the divine, treats weeping not as a sign of grief but as a sign of love, so intense it overflows the body. The texts of this path list the physical signs that overcome a true devotee in the height of love, and weeping stands near the top of them, tears streaming uncontrollably, the body trembling, the voice breaking, the hair standing on end, the ordinary self dissolved in a flood of feeling for the beloved divine. There is a special phrase for these tears of bliss, the tears that come not from pain but from joy too great to hold, from love that has filled the heart past its banks. The most famous of the great devotees, a saint remembered for his ecstatic love, was said to weep almost constantly, to fall into floods of tears at the mere name of his beloved. His weeping, treated by his followers not as instability, but as the visible mark of a soul utterly given over to divine love. To weep for love of the divine, in this tradition, is among the highest things a human being can do, a sign that the heart has opened so completely that it can no longer contain what pours through it. And this points at something the science quietly confirms, the thing we found at the very start. that we weep not only at sorrow but at the overflow of any feeling too great to contain, at beauty, at love, at joy, at awe. The Bhakti tradition built an entire spiritual path on exactly this, on cultivating a love so vast that it breaks the banks of the self and runs out through the eyes. They understood, without any science, that the tear is what happens when meaning exceeds the vessel, that the same salt water falls whether the heart is broken by grief or broken open by love, and they chose to break it open by love. The Hindu thinkers who analyzed the emotions even built a sophisticated theory of aesthetic feeling, of the refined emotions stirred by art and beauty and devotion, and they knew that the highest of these could bring a person to tears, that to be moved to weeping by beauty or by love was to taste something close to the divine. The overflow that the science identifies as the trigger of emotional tears, the traditions turned into a discipline, a path, a way of opening the heart until it could not help but spill. There is a tenderness in this that is easy to miss, in a world that often treats tears as a failure of composure, something to apologize for. The devotional traditions treated them as proof of love, as the body's most honest confession that it had been moved beyond its own control. A devotee who could weep at the name of the beloved was thought to have something a more guarded soul lacked, a heart not yet sealed shut, a capacity to be touched. The poems of these traditions are full of longing, of the ache of separation from the divine and the flood of joy at reunion, and tears run all through them. The tears of the lover who cannot stop weeping for the beloved. To be able to weep, in this view, is itself a gift, a sign that one has not gone numb, that one can still be reached. And the deepest devotees prayed not to be spared their tears, but to be given more of them, to be made soft enough to weep, because the weeping was the sign that love was alive. They would have understood perfectly the desert monks half a world away who prized the gift of tears above almost everything, though the two traditions never met and wept, on the surface, for opposite reasons, one for sorrow over sin and the other for joy in love. Beneath the surface they were doing the same thing, prizing the soft and weeping heart over the hard and dry one, treating the tear as the sign of a soul still open to what is highest. The thread runs on through tradition after tradition. The Hebrew scriptures gave us the haunting image we began with, the plea to a God who is asked to gather the writer's tears into a bottle, to record each one in a book, the conviction that not a single tear falls unseen or uncounted by heaven. The same tradition treasured tears of repentance, the weeping that softens a hardened heart and turns it back toward the good, and to this day, at the most sacred surviving wall of its ancient temple, people come from across the world to press their faces to the stone and weep and leave their written prayers in its cracks. In the Islamic scriptures there are those whose eyes overflow with tears when they hear what they recognize as truth, weeping named as the mark of a heart genuinely moved, of awe and reverence made visible in water. And long before any of these, the classical poets of the ancient Mediterranean wrote of the tears of things. The sense that there are tears at the heart of the world itself, that sorrow is woven into the nature of existence, and that to feel it fully, to weep at the passing of all things, is part of what it is to be truly human and awake. Across every one of these traditions, in languages and theologies that often understood each other not at all, the same recognition keeps surfacing, that tears are sacred, that they cleanse and connect and open the heart, that they rise at the meeting points between the human being and what is highest and deepest, and that to weep, honestly and fully, is not a thing to be ashamed of, but one of the most human and most holy acts there is. Return, for a moment, to the small glass vials in the ancient graves. Whatever their actual use, the impulse they came to stand for is the same one running through every tradition we have touched. The sense that a tear is too precious to simply let fall and vanish, that the grief and love poured out in weeping deserve to be gathered, kept, honoured, remembered. It is a strange and beautiful instinct, and a deeply human one. We do not bottle our other fluids or treasure our other secretions. But tears, alone among the things the body makes, struck people across the whole span of history as worth saving, worth recording, worth lifting up to heaven. There is a recognition in that older than any doctrine, a wordless sense, shared by the desert monk and the grieving widow and the ecstatic devotee alike, that when a human being weeps, something is happening that matters, something that touches the center of what a person is and reaches beyond the person toward whatever is largest and most real. They could not say exactly what, but they all felt it, and they all reached, in their different ways, to honor it. Why would so many separate peoples, with no contact between them, arrive at the same reverence for the same salt water? The simplest answer, and the truest, is that they were all looking closely at the same thing, the human being and its tears, and the thing they were looking at really does have the properties they kept finding in it. Tears really do cleanse, in a way the chemistry now partly confirms. Tears really do open the heart and bond us to one another, as the psychology now shows. Tears really do rise at the overflow of meaning, at the points where a life touches what matters most. The traditions converged on the holiness of tears, for the same reason different explorers converge on the location of a mountain. It was actually there. This should not be overstated, and honesty requires admitting where the traditions differ. They did not all weep for the same reasons, or read the same meaning in their tears. The desert monk wept in sorrow over his own hardness. The devotee wept in joy at divine love. The compassionate one wept for the suffering of all beings. The mourner wept simply for the dead. These are not the same tears, and the traditions built different teachings around them. Some prized weeping above almost all else, others were more wary of it, suspicious of emotion that might be mere indulgence, and warned against tears that came from self-pity rather than from a genuinely softened heart. The picture is not perfectly uniform, and to pretend it is would be to force a tidiness onto the human record that is not there. But underneath the real differences lies a real agreement, and it is the agreement that matters, that tears, rightly understood, are not nothing, that the weeping heart touches something the dry heart misses, and that this small salt water carries a weight far out of proportion to its size. And there is one more thing they sensed, the thing this whole story has been circling, that the traditions felt without being able to prove. They felt that weeping connected the human being not just to other humans but to the cosmos, to the divine, to the largest order of things. They put tears in heaven's bottle. They saw in them a second baptism, a sign of the soul's rebirth, the overflow of a love as wide as creation. They sensed, in the salt water of grief and joy, a thread that ran from the human heart out to the furthest reaches of what is. And the strange discovery of the science, that the tear is shaped by the very same laws that shape the stars, that the salt in it was forged in dying suns, gives that ancient intuition a backbone no one expected. The traditions felt the kinship between the tear and the cosmos. The science, without meaning to, found it. It is worth pausing on what kind of agreement this is, because it is not the usual kind. The traditions did not predict the chemistry of tears or the fractal structure of nebulae. They had no way to. What they had was a different instrument, turned the other way, inward, onto the lived experience of weeping, rather than outward, onto its physical mechanism. And from that inward looking they drew conclusions about what tears mean, what they do to the soul, where they connect us. The science, looking outward, drew conclusions about what tears are made of, how they work, what laws shape them. These are different questions, and it would be easy to say they simply have nothing to do with each other, that the meaning of a tear and the physics of a tear are separate matters that happen to share an object. But the strange thing, the thing this whole story keeps running into, is that the two keep landing in the same place. The inward-looking said tears cleanse, and the outward-looking found chemistry that cleanses. The inward-looking said tears connect, and the outward-looking found a signal that bonds. The inward-looking said tears reach toward the cosmos and the divine, and the outward-looking found a drop shaped by the laws of the stars and salted with their substance. Two instruments, pointed in opposite directions, reading the same result. That is either the strangest coincidence in this whole strange story, or it is a sign that the inward and the outward are not as separate as we tend to think. So the traditions and the laboratories, approaching from opposite ends of human knowing, meet in the same place, over a single drop of salt water on a human cheek. The mystics felt their way to it through centuries of prayer and attention. The scientists measured their way to it through chemistry and microscopes and telescopes. And what both of them found is that the tear is far more than it seems, that this small, ordinary thing, which you have made 1,000 times and wiped away without a thought, carries the chemistry of your feeling, the call of your need, the shape of the stars, and the salt of the cosmos, and has been recognized by nearly every people who ever lived as something close to holy. There remains one last question, the deepest of all, the one that decides what all of this finally means. Is the kinship between your tears and the heavens a real thing? A true connection that should change how you understand your own small griefs? Or is it a beautiful pattern we are reading into a universe that does not care? Are the traditions right that there is something sacred in your weeping? Or are they, and we, simply moved by a rhyme of shapes that means nothing at all? That is the question we have to face squarely, with honesty and without flinching from either answer, before we are done. It is the question of whether the map in your tear is a message, or only a map. And it is where we go, finally, now. So which is it? A message, or only a map? We have come a long way to arrive at this single question, and it cannot be dodged. On one side stands a possibility that would change how you understand your own grief, that the resemblance between the salt water on your cheek and the clouds where stars are born is real and meaningful, a true kinship between the smallest, most personal thing you make and the largest things there are, a sign that you are woven into the cosmos rather than stranded in it. On the other side stands a colder possibility, and an honest mind has to look straight at it, that the resemblance means nothing at all, that the human animal is a pattern-seeking creature that finds faces in clouds and stories in the stars, and that the likeness between a tear and a nebula is just one more shape our hungry eyes have stitched together out of a universe that does not care. These are the two answers. One of them is true, and the whole weight of this story comes down to which. Think back over the ground we have crossed to get here, because the answer depends on holding all of it in view at once. It began, as everything here began, with a single drop and a careless hand wiping it away. We started with the plain, almost embarrassing fact of a tear, the salt water that falls from your eyes when you are moved, and we asked the questions no one usually asks. Why do we cry at all? Why are we the only creature that weeps from feeling? What is in a tear, and why does it leave when it dries? A tiny landscape of branching rivers and coasts. We found that emotional tears carry the chemistry of stress and feeling, that they are a signal evolved to call others near, that the body weeps through the same nerves it uses to calm and heal itself. We found that the shape the tear leaves is a fractal, the same branching design that runs through rivers and veins and lightning and trees and lungs, drawn everywhere by the same rules of flow and growth. We followed that shape up to the clouds where stars are born and found it there too, in the filaments of gas that cradle new suns. And we learned that order itself blooms from chaos wherever energy flows, in a drying drop and in a collapsing cloud alike. And we found that the traditions, looking inward across thousands of years, had sensed all of this in their own language, treating tears as sacred, as cleansing, as the meeting point of the human and the divine. All of that is behind us now. The question is what it adds up to. Let us take the cold possibility seriously, because it deserves to be taken seriously, and because a story that only flatters you is not worth your time. The strongest objection is the simplest. Human beings see patterns that are not there. We are built for it. A face in the moon, an animal in a cloud, a figure in the shadows of a dark room, the sense that the dice are due to turn in our favor. All of these are the mind reaching for pattern in randomness, and the reaching is so deep and so automatic that we usually cannot switch it off. There is even a name for it, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections among unrelated things. And it is not a flaw so much as a feature, a survival tool. The ancestor who saw a predator in the rustling grass and was wrong lost nothing. The ancestor who failed to see the predator that was really there lost everything. So we are descended from the ones who saw patterns, including false ones, because false alarms were cheap and missed real threats were deadly. We are, every one of us, machines for finding patterns, primed to see connection everywhere, including where there is none. And the obvious worry is that the whole of this story, the tear that looks like a nebula, is exactly that. A pattern our pattern-hungry minds have found and fallen in love with, signifying nothing. The history of human thought is littered with exactly this mistake, and it is worth remembering how often we have fooled ourselves. People once saw canals on Mars and built whole theories of a dying alien civilization around them. The canals were an illusion, the eye connecting scattered dots into lines that were not there. People have seen faces on the surface of Mars, figures in the static of untuned televisions, hidden messages in records played backward, the hand of fate in coincidences that simple arithmetic shows to be inevitable. We are so good at finding patterns that we find them constantly where none exist, and the more we want a pattern to be real, the more easily we see it. And we very much want this one to be real. We want to matter. We want to belong to something larger than our brief, fragile lives. We want our grief to mean something, to connect to something, to not be merely the firing of neurons in an indifferent skull. A creature that wants to belong to the cosmos as badly as we do is exactly the creature that should be most suspicious of finding. Look, here is the proof. The cosmos, in our very tears. The wish is so strong that it ought to make us doubt the finding. The objection has a sharp second edge. Look at how many shapes there are in the world, and how many in the sky. Billions of dried tears, each a little different. Countless clouds of gas scattered across the heavens, in every form imaginable. With so vast a stock of shapes on both sides, is it any wonder that you can find a tear that looks like a nebula? Search long enough through enough images, and you will find a resemblance between almost anything and almost anything else. Pick the matches, ignore the misses, and you can build a sense of cosmic harmony out of pure chance, the way a person convinced of an omen remembers the few dreams that came true and forgets the thousands that did not. Maybe that is all this is, a selection of the lucky matches, the tears that happened to resemble the stars held up while the ones that resembled nothing were quietly set aside. And there is a third edge, sharper still. Even where the resemblance is real, even where a tear and a nebula genuinely share a branching shape, that shared shape does not mean they are connected. Two things can look alike for reasons that have nothing to do with any bond between them. A river and a lightning bolt share a shape and have never touched. Likeness is not linkage. To see the same form in a tear and a star and conclude that your grief reaches the heavens is to mistake a resemblance for a relationship, a rhyme for a thread. This is the deepest of the objections and the one that most deserves respect, because it names the exact place where so much pseudoscience goes wrong. There is a whole industry of people who take a real fact from physics, a genuine resemblance or a true piece of strangeness, and then smuggle in, on the back of it, a claim the physics never supported, that your thoughts reshape reality, that your feelings broadcast to the cosmos, that everything is connected by an energy science is too narrow to measure. The move is always the same. Start with something true and surprising, and use the surprise to wave through something false and comforting. This story has tried, at every step, to refuse that move, and it must refuse it here most of all. The shared shape of the tear and the nebula does not connect them. It is not a thread, not a signal, not a channel. A tear in a quiet room and a nebula 1,000 light years away are doing nothing to each other, and never will. To say otherwise would be to commit the very error the objection warns against, and to betray everything this careful path has been built on. So, we do not say otherwise. We say only what is true, and stop exactly where the truth stops. These are serious objections, and the honest answer is to concede every one of them exactly as far as it goes, and not 1 inch further. Yes, we are pattern-seeking creatures, and we must be on guard against finding meaning where there is none. Yes, with enough shapes to choose from, some resemblances arise by pure chance, and we must not cherry-pick the matches and ignore the misses. And yes, above all, 2 things sharing a shape does not mean they are connected by any hidden bond, and to claim otherwise would be exactly the kind of overreach this story has refused from the start. If anyone tells you that your tears are linked to the stars by a mysterious energy, that weeping sends signals to the cosmos, that your grief and a distant nebula are joined by some invisible thread, they have left the ground of what can be known and wandered into wishful thinking. There is no such thread. There is no such energy. The tear does not reach the stars, and the stars do not feel your weeping. On all of this, the cold objection is right, and we say so plainly. And the objection about cherry-picking deserves a real answer too, not a dismissal. It is true that if you hunted through millions of dried tears and millions of images of space, you could find lucky matches and parade them while hiding the misses. If the whole claim rested on holding up one pretty tear next to one pretty nebula and saying, "Look," it would be worthless, a magic trick. But that is not where the claim rests. It does not rest on any particular tear resembling any particular nebula. It rests on the fact, established quite apart from tears, that the same mathematical structures, fractals, branching networks, self-organizing patterns, genuinely recur across nature at every scale, in rivers and lungs and lightning and clouds and the gas between the stars, and that these recurrences are measured and quantified, not selected by a hopeful eye. The tear is not special evidence. It is just one more instance of a pattern, whose reality is established by 1,000 other instances that have nothing to do with tears or with our longing to matter. We are not building a cosmic harmony out of 2 cherry-picked images. We are noticing that a tear, like nearly everything else, falls under rules that the universe applies everywhere. That is the opposite of cherry-picking. It is recognizing the general in the particular. But notice what survives all of that, because something does, and it is not small. The objections defeat the inflated version of the claim, the mystical version, the version that imagines a literal connection between your tears and the sky. They do not touch the real version, which never claimed a connection in the first place. The real claim was always narrower and stranger, not that the tear and the nebula are connected, but that they are made by the same laws, and that is not a pattern read into randomness. It is measured physics. The branching of a fractal is not a face in a cloud. It is a mathematical structure that can be quantified, its dimension computed, its presence confirmed or denied by calculation rather than by the hopeful eye. The clouds where stars are born really do have a fractal structure, established by measurement, not by impression. The dried tear really does crystallize in branching dendrites by the plain physics of evaporation and salt. The same principles of flow and branching and self-organization really do govern matter at every scale, in the laboratory and in the telescope alike. This is not apophenia. This is the discovery that the universe runs on a small set of rules that repeat at every size, and that the tear and the star, however far apart, are both subject to them. The resemblance is not a trick of the mind. It is a fact about the laws, and here is the test that separates a real pattern from a wished-for one. A face in a cloud disappears when someone else looks, or when the cloud drifts, or when you measure it. There is nothing there to measure. But the fractal structure of a star-forming cloud does not disappear when you measure it. You can put a number on it, and a different scientist with a different telescope will get the same number. The branching of the dried tear does not depend on who is hoping to see it. It follows from the physics of salt and water and evaporation, and it would happen in an empty room with no one watching. This is the difference between a pattern projected by the mind and a pattern present in the world. The first vanishes under scrutiny, the second survives it. The tear and the nebula pass the test that the face on Mars fails. Their shared structure is not in the eye of the beholder. It is in the laws that built them both, and it is there whether anyone is moved by it or not. And the kinship goes deeper than shape, into substance, where there is no room for doubt at all. The sodium in your tears was forged inside stars. This is not a poetic flourish. It is established astrophysics, as solid as anything we know. The heavy elements did not exist when the universe began. They were cooked in stellar cores and scattered by stellar deaths. And every atom of salt in your body, every atom of salt in every tear you have ever shed, was made in a star that lived and died before the sun was born. That is not a resemblance. That is an origin. You are not like the stars in some loose metaphorical way. You are made of their ashes, salted with their substance, built from material that passed through the hearts of dying suns. The cold objection cannot touch this, because it is not a pattern at all, but a lineage, a literal physical descent from the stars to the salt on your face. So when we strip away everything the objections rightly destroy, here is what is left standing, solid and unmysterious and true. Your tears are made of star stuff, and they are shaped by the same laws that shape the stars, not connected, not joined by hidden threads, but kin, in substance and in form, by origin and by law. That much is simply real. Follow the chain once, slowly, because it is worth feeling its full length. Somewhere, more than 5 billion years ago, a massive star reached the end of its life and exploded, flinging the elements it had forged across space. Among them was sodium, an atom that had not existed until that star made it. That sodium drifted in a cloud for an age, mixed with the debris of other dead stars, until the cloud collapsed and formed our sun and the earth beneath your feet. The sodium became part of the young planet, worked into its rocks and washed into its seas, taken up by the first living cells that arose in those seas, passed down through every generation of life across billions of years, into the bodies of fish and the bodies of the creatures that crawled onto land, and at last into you, into your blood and your sweat and the salt water that gathers in your eyes when you are moved. The sodium in the tear you cried this year is the same sodium that a star made before the earth existed. Nothing was added to it. Nothing was lost. It is the same matter, on an unbroken journey from a stellar explosion to your grief. When you taste salt on your lips as you weep, you are tasting something a star made, carried to you across 5 billion years and an unimaginable distance, to fall, at last, from your eyes. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal history of the atoms in your tears, which leaves the last question, the one science cannot answer, the one that is finally yours to settle. We know the tear is made of star stuff and shaped by cosmic law. We know this is real and not imagined. But what does it mean? Does the kinship between your tears and the heavens matter? Or is it just a curious fact, true but empty, like the fact that your fingernails grow at the same rate the continents drift apart? Here science reaches the end of what it can say. Science can tell you that the sodium came from stars and that the shape obeys the same mathematics. It cannot tell you whether that should move you, whether it means anything for how you live, whether your grief is dignified or your loneliness eased by knowing that you are built from the cosmos and wear its patterns. That is not a question of fact. It is a question of meaning, and meaning is not something a microscope or a telescope can measure. It is something a human being decides. The traditions decided one way. They looked at the tear and the heavens and felt a kinship and called it sacred and built around it whole paths of prayer and compassion and love. The hard materialist decides the other way, granting the facts but refusing them any weight, insisting that a tear made of star stuff is still just salt water and that to feel anything more is sentiment. Both are looking at the same facts. The facts do not choose between them. You do. But do not mistake this for saying that meaning is arbitrary, that you can simply believe whatever feels nice. The facts constrain you, even if they do not decide for you. You are not free to believe that your tears are literally signaling the stars, because that is false. You are not free to believe there is a mystical energy flowing between your grief and a nebula, because there is not. What you are free to do is decide how to hold the facts that are true, what weight to give them, whether the real kinship between your tears and the cosmos, the shared substance, and the shared law, strikes you as a hollow curiosity or as something worth being moved by. That is a genuine choice, and it is not arbitrary, because it is a choice about how to respond to something real. To be moved by the fact that you are made of stars is not to believe a falsehood. It is to feel the weight of a truth, and to refuse to be moved by it is also a choice, a decision to grant the fact and withhold the feeling. Neither science nor anyone else can make that choice for you. But it is worth knowing that it is a choice, and that the materialist who grants the facts and feels nothing has not proven anything. He has simply chosen, as you must, what the truth will mean to him. And this is the same fork we have stood at before in every one of these journeys. When we followed grief down into its strange geometry, we found the same thing, a real structure underneath the pain, and the same question of whether that structure consoles or merely describes. When we traced the human heart and its rhythms, when we asked what the body is and where its order comes from, when we followed the flow of energy that builds a star and learned that the same flow builds and sustains you, when we asked whether the patterns running through everything are a kind of music the universe is playing, each time we arrived here, at the border between what science can establish and what only you can decide. The facts pile up, astonishing and solid, that you are made of stars, that the same laws run through your body and the galaxies, that order blooms from chaos in your cells and in the clouds alike, that information and pattern reach through everything, that nothing in you is separate from the cosmos that made it. Science hands you all of this and then falls silent, because the last step, from fact to meaning, is not a step science knows how to take. It can show you that you are woven from the universe. It cannot tell you to feel at home in it. There is a thread running through all of these journeys, and it is worth naming, because it is the same thread that runs through the tear. Again and again, we have found that the boundary we draw between ourselves and the cosmos is far thinner and stranger than it feels. We have found that the order of a living body is paid for by a flow of energy that begins in a star, that the same patterns of branching and flow run through your lungs and the galaxies, that the heavy atoms of your flesh were forged in stellar furnaces, that order and structure bloom from chaos by the same principles in your cells and in the clouds of space. We have found that you are not a separate thing dropped into a universe of dead matter, but a knot of that very matter, organized for a while by the flow of energy through it, wearing the shapes the universe wears everywhere, made of the substance the universe is made of. The tear is one more proof of this, perhaps the most intimate proof of all, because it is so small and so personal and so obviously yours, and yet it turns out to carry, in its salt and its shape, the signature of the whole. Every one of these stories has been, underneath, the same story, that the line between you and the cosmos is not where you thought it was, that you are more woven into the whole than your separate skin suggests. The salt of the stars in the water of your grief is just the clearest place that truth ever showed itself. That choice of what to make of it has always been yours in every one of these stories, and it is yours again now. So let it come home, all of it, to the only place it has ever really lived, which is your own face, wet with your own tears. Here is what is true, what no objection can take from you, what you can carry out of this and keep. The next time you weep, whatever the reason, grief or joy or beauty or love, you will be doing something far stranger and larger than you ever knew. The salt running down your cheek was made in the furnace of a dying star. The shape it will leave when it dries is the shape of rivers and lightning and the clouds where new suns are born. The water carries the chemistry of your feeling, the call of your need, the same branching design the universe draws at every scale of its being. You are not a small thing crying alone in an indifferent void. You are a part of the cosmos, made of its substance, shaped by its laws, weeping its salt back into the world it came from. The materialist is right that this changes none of the physics, but the traditions were right too, in the way that matters more, that there is something here worth honouring, something sacred in the small salt water of a weeping human face, because in it the whole vast universe is somehow present, folded into a single drop. Notice that you do not have to choose between the two. The materialist and the mystic are not really fighting over the facts. They agree about the facts. They are choosing different responses to the same truth, and you are allowed to take the response that opens you rather than the one that closes you, so long as you keep faith with the facts themselves. You can know, with full scientific honesty, that there is no thread between your tears and the stars, and still feel, with full human depth, the weight of being made of those stars and shaped by their laws. The knowing and the feeling do not contradict each other. The cold facts and the warm response can live in the same mind, in the same moment, in the same falling tear. That is not confusion. It is wholeness, the union of the clear eye and the open heart that every tradition at its best was trying to teach, and that the honest love of truth does not forbid but makes possible. The ancients bottled their tears because they sensed, without knowing why, that each one was precious. They were right, though not for the reasons they imagined. Each tear is precious because it is a meeting place, where the chemistry of your heart meets the chemistry of the stars, where the smallest grief carries the largest patterns, where the human and the cosmic touch for a moment in a drop of salt water that will dry and leave behind its tiny map of the heavens. You have made this map 1,000 times. You will make it again the next time something moves you past the edge of what you can hold, and when you do, you might remember what it is, not weakness, not a thing to wipe away in shame. A small act of the universe, weeping through you, leaving its signature in salt. The map in the tear is not a message sent to you from the stars. It is something stranger and truer than a message. It is the stars themselves, in you, taking the only shape they know, the shape of reaching, of spreading, of opening, the shape of a thing that has been moved. Let the tear fall, let it dry if it will, and know, as it does, that you were never separate from the sky. There is an old loneliness at the centre of being human, the sense of being a small and temporary thing, awake for a little while in a universe that stretches out cold and vast and indifferent on every side. Much of what we do, much of what we build and believe, is an answer to that loneliness, a reaching for something larger to belong to. And here, in the most unlikely place, in the salt water of your own weeping, is an answer that does not require you to believe anything false. You belong to the universe because you are made of it. You are not a stranger here. The stuff of your body was made in the stars. The patterns of your body are the patterns of the cosmos. And even your grief, when it overflows and runs down your face, wears the shape and carries the substance of the heavens. You do not have to earn your place in the universe, or argue your way into it, or take it on faith. You are already in it, woven from it, inseparable from it, down to the salt in your tears. The traditions reach for this with their bottles and their prayers. The science arrived at it with its telescopes and its microscopes, and it turns out to be simply true. You are made of it. You always were, and every time you weep, it weeps with you.